Welcome to the Biblioteca Orientalis. Today we have Professor Ashraf Salama, who is professor at Strathclyde University in Glasgow. Professor, you have done intensive research and writing on architecture and urbanism in the Gulf. In this meeting, we want to focus on your two key contributions. Demystifying Doha, the first one, on architecture and urbanism of an emerging city, published by Ashgate in 2013, and a second, which is Building Migrant Cities in the Gulf, Urban Transformations in the Middle East, published by Tauris in 2019. Can you give us a glimpse on the first one briefly and more details on the second? The underpinning research, the team you worked with, and the focus of each book. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me today in this conversation and in this coffee, virtual coffee. I would say quickly that Demystifying Doha on architecture and urbanism of an emerging city is explicitly and exclusively focusing on one city, which is Doha. Although it has a big section on contextual aspects of globalization and how it impacts cities and urbanization and urban development in the Gulf. But the focus mainly is on Doha, trying to examine urban governance and see how decision-making impact the urban structure of the city, analyze image-making practices and different types of architectural trends, explore people engagement with the urban environment, and identify challenges related to sustainable urbanism. But starting from 2013 up to 2019, which is last year, we have undertaken a lot of research and research activities that generated a number of publications, including Building Migrant Cities in the Gulf. And the book, generally speaking, focuses on a number of Gulf cities collectively, but at the same time look from a comparative perspective on 4 cities explicitly: Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Doha, and Manama. And we look at the notion of migration and how migration manifests in the urban development and the urban environment. Migrant-based urbanism and the socio-economic realities that generate it. We look at how large-scale projects and mega projects impact urbanization and urban development, and how it is seen as a catalyst for migrant-based urbanism. We look at the everyday urban environments, lifestyle theories, and how they can be operationalized to examine migrant communities and how they perceive the environment in these cities. The underpinning research, and I must acknowledge Qatar National Research Fund, because the underpinning research was funded based or through the very, very competitive program of the National Priorities Research Fund by Qatar Foundation, or funded by Qatar Foundation, through 2 projects that reached about 1.8 million. The first project was conducted as a partnership between Qatar University, when I was there, and Technical University of Munich. And then the second project between Strathclyde University and Qatar University. And in the 2 projects, we had partners in the 2 institutions. The first one was Professor Alan Serstein, who is urban geographer, urban economist. And in the second one, we had Dr. Hatem Ibrahim from Qatar University as co-investigator. In the 2 projects and throughout this process, Florian Wiedmann was working with me as a postdoctoral research associate and was really active in generating ideas about the work, and he collaborated with me in the authorship of the 2 books. And obviously he led the development of the second book, which is building migrant cities. And so now we had very, very good team, excellent team, researchers working with us on various aspects from interviews, surveys, space syntax analysis, and a number of other social science research activities.
What are the key aspects of migration that you're focusing on in building migrant cities?
First of all, we look at migration from a historic perspective, because Gulf cities have seen a lot of migration and migration patterns throughout the past 70, 80 years, or even before. People from Persia, people from India, people from East Africa were migrating to the Gulf on a temporary basis, or were stopping by the Gulf in the journeys to India, for example, from Africa to India, and the other way around. So we're looking at how these communities historically contributed to architecture and urbanism in Gulf cities. And we look at how these communities have contributed to architecture and urbanism historically. And then currently, we look at how these communities are also contributing, but the migrant communities are classified now into larger scale categories, where you have migrants from Europe. And when we say migrants here, we mean the transient dimension, which is basically temporary migration for a number of years, where everybody goes and stay few years and leave. And how we classify these migrant populations. And the reason on focusing on migration basically is that the migrant communities form the majority, which is a unique phenomenon that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, where migrants are reaching 80 and 90% of the total population. For example, you can see in Emirates, it's 89%, and in Qatar, it's 85%. So, and how this is impacting visions, development strategies, real estate development, work sectors, and all these aspects were really important in that second book, Building Migrant Cities. Is specifically looking at the notion of real estate development, housing supply, and how housing choices and housing, or the overall housing market is impacted by these groups. But when we say groups, we also look at how these groups vary, because we cannot look at people as one entity. So we look at people in terms of cultural backgrounds, education backgrounds, where are they coming from, past experiences, and all these factors were important to understand these migrant communities. So the demographic profile, knowing that, for example, in the Gulf, the majority of migrant communities, especially in the labor class, are more than 60% of the total migrants, which is a large percentage. And many of them are coming on low wages and working in the low sector and low paying job classes. So these are the key aspects that we looked at from migration perspective.
I can see a clear focus on the idea of lifestyles as they relate to housing types. Can you give us just a quick idea about what do you mean by lifestyle theories and how they relate to housing?
It's the whole idea of lifestyle theories is based on our general understanding that environment influences people and their perception, their cognition, their choices, their satisfaction of the environment. So, but as I said earlier, when we say people, we have to look at them in terms of different groups and different entities coming from different cultural backgrounds and who have different social aspirations and educational backgrounds. And these have repercussions on the perception, choice, and satisfaction. So this idea started with me back in 2006 when I was doing some research on affordable housing in the city of Jeddah, where we examined different groups based on lifestyle theories. And I'll come to the explanation of lifestyle theories in just a second. And then in expanding this in the current work, or in the work on smaller Gulf states, we said, let's look at what other disciplines are saying about lifestyles. So when we look at sociology, ethnography, environmental psychology, and how they generate knowledge about understanding people, and how can we bring this knowledge to understand architecture and urban development. So we developed a framework, and the framework is based on these disciplines, which are not architectural. From sociology, for example, we looked at Pierre Bourdieu, who wrote about habitus, who wrote about status, who wrote about past experiences, and how these impact people understanding of their environments. We took that perspective. In terms of anthropology, we looked at the psychology of taste, how people make preferences, and the psychology of making a preference and making a choice based on people's attitude with respect to integration with the community, isolation from the wider society, their preferences in terms of where do they want their house to be in the city, on the periphery, on the center, and why. And the reason we discussed other layers to be able to interpret why, we looked at the idea of work. So work style also impact housing choice. So a career-oriented person would be very different from a wage earner person, would be different from a self-employed. The meaning of home will be different for each one. So we looked at these characteristics and how these would generate an understanding of perception, choice, and satisfaction of the home environment.
You also focus on everyday urban environment of migrant communities. How do you explain this form of analysis?
This form of analysis, many in architecture consider it non-architectural or non-urban, although it's, in my view, it's at the core of understanding people. It's very similar to the idea of lifestyles, but the difference here is that we examine the actual practice, the actual engagement with the environment. In lifestyles, we look at perception, satisfaction, the way people express these aspects. But here, we observe the actual practice and trying to examine the social and the spatial dimensions of the environment, which is basically urban form, characteristics of the urban environment, and the resulting human behavior. So this is the idea. But that examination really cannot be done in an ad hoc basis. It has to be systematic, and it has to generate reliable knowledge. And that reliable knowledge needs to follow certain techniques coming from environmental psychology. The design research community in America, for example, have generated lots of tools and techniques that range from cognitive mapping to behavioral mapping to photo interviewing to various ethnographic techniques. All these have generated really important insights on how people engage with housing environments, urban spaces in the historic centers of Gulf cities, and at the same time in newly developed neighborhoods.
Final, Professor, we want to know from you, what are the 3 key teachings that can be learned from Building Migrant Cities book?
I would say 3 points as required. The first is that the global city represents, especially in the Gulf, represents a hybrid condition. And any hybrid condition cannot be examined from one perspective. It needs hybrid modes of thinking. from different perspectives, and holistic frameworks that enable our understanding and of the key influences on these cities. So that's first key lesson. The other one is that, or the second one would be the production of city or the urban environment need to look at, when we examine these, we need to look at three elements. The imagined environment, the measured environment, and the experienced environment. How the three will integrate. The relationship is really very important. And these elements cannot be looked at in isolation. We have to look at them and how each impact the other two, how decision-making impact people experiences, people choices, and how people choices are influenced by larger scale companies and different housing, spatial practices of companies and real estate developers. So all these aspects are really important. The third one, which I would say sometimes people disagree with this idea, that we really need to continue to seek to acquire knowledge about the everyday environment, because the everyday environment is simply about how the urban environment works. So one would not trust a medical doctor who knows the art of healing, but doesn't know how the human body functions. Exactly in architecture and planning and urban design, we wouldn't trust a designer who knows or who can generate beautiful designs and create wonderful designs without knowing how the environment works. So I think the knowledge about the everyday environment must be a component of practice, research, and education that legitimize our practices and our existence as a profession.
Thank you very much, Professor Salama.
Thank you very much, Professor Petricioli, and it was really a pleasure to have this conversation. Thanks.